Hi, I'm Craig, and I'm going to show you some rough footage of how I make turquoise earrings. I find it very relaxing to sit out there and do some silver work and cut some stones. I thought you might be interested in seeing how all the steps work, and you might keep it in mind next time you're looking at a set of earrings in a store and you're wondering why the artist is charging what he is. Maybe you'll remember all the steps it took to make them. So I used a couple different kind of crude phone cameras. I hope you can kind of get an idea of what we're going to see. I'll narrate it along the way. Let's get started.
All right, the first step is to take your gemstones, which I showed you how to make in the other video, and to wrap some bezel wire around them and mark it and cut it to prepare to make the bezels for the gemstones. And that's what I'm doing here. Next, we take those bezel wires that have been marked and cut to the sanding drum, and I sand it wet to get the ends of the wire nice and square and get it to size. Then you want to solder the ends of the bezels together to make a nice clean bezel, and that's what I'm doing here. I like to place my solder onto the bezel joint using a solder pick, as you can see in my left hand. And once I have the solder placed, I can get it spread out in the joint with my pencil solder torch. I don't use my big torch for this operation because it's just too strong. Now I'm doing the second bezel for the other earring. And as you can see, I'm having a little bit of difficulty getting the little bead of solder exactly where I want it. But the titanium solder pick is useful for putting it right in place on the joint. Here's a close-up of the finished solder joint. Now I'm just going to put the bezels around each stone and make sure they fit. And I use a bezel pusher to kind of shape it right up against the stone. Once your bezels are done, then it's time to go ahead and lay out some sheet silver for the earrings. I'm actually using a teardrop shape for these earrings. Ought to be real nice. The next thing you want to do is get your jeweler's saw ready to cut out the earrings. And I like to put a little beeswax on my saw blade as I'm getting ready to saw them. And I take my 24 gauge sheet over to the V block and start sawing it. Once I got started, I use a simple action. You'll notice maybe if you look, I have a drawer pulled out beneath, and that's what I have a tray in there to catch all my silver tailings from my sawing and filing. I just pull that drawer out whenever I'm doing those operations, and eventually I'll have enough silver tailings where I can send those off to be melted down. And you want to move the work when you're sawing. You want to keep your saw pretty much in the same place, but move your work. And here you can see I'm using my fingers to hold the work down and also to move it around as I'm sawing off the teardrop shape of my earring. One thing I'll say as you're watching me saw here is you want to make sure you get yourself a good saw frame. I had myself a budget one that I used for years, and it's kind of difficult to adjust and not a whole lot of fun to use. And I finally splurged and bought myself this nice German-made one. And it's just a much finer instrument. Feels better in your hand. It's much easier to change the blade out in it as well. Okay, so here I have one of my earrings cut out. And you can see where I've marked with my Sharpie on the silver to get the other one cut. And I'm going to do that now as well. The thing to remember with earrings is every step, everything you do, it has to be done twice, and they need to look pretty close to exactly the same. And my wife especially complains if I don't get a pair of earrings where they look exact. And she says that women are very picky about that. Now I'm using my sterling silver stamp to mark the backs of each earring, and I'm also using my little cactus-shaped hallmark that I put on my pieces. After cleaning the silver and the bezels in pickling acid, I'm going to remove them and rinse them and get ready to do the soldering operation. Now I'm using a nice camel hair brush to brush on some good flux onto the sheet, and I will also place my bezels into flux and place them onto the sheets into position for soldering. And it's worthwhile taking a little time to get them lined up exactly where you want them. So here I am positioning my bezels, getting ready to solder. And you want to remember to heat the metal up while it's got the flux on it to kind of dry it out and toast it, and it will also kind of hold everything in place when you're getting your solder on. So that's what I'm doing here. Otherwise, once the flux liquefies, it'll make the solder kind of move around. Now, since I have shaky hands, I like to kind of do my soldering this way, where I put them on this screen on this tripod, and then I can just place my little snippets of solder up there with tweezers. And I really envy people with steady hands who can just use a wire solder and just feed it right into the piece live while they're soldering, but that's too difficult for me, so I like to use this technique. So any of you who share my affliction of shaky hands, this may be an answer for you. So now we're going to go ahead and do the soldering operation. I'm using my torch, my big torch here for this. And if you look closely, you should see the soldering start to run around the bezel. Once it's molten, you can see it change. And let's do the other one now. This one, I think you get a little better angle at seeing it once the solder starts to run and it gets into place. And you want to make sure it goes all the way around the bezel. You don't want any gaps. Sometimes I'll hit it from the top a little bit just to reinforce that. So these pieces are soldered. Now they need to be matched up and trimmed, and you can see I've got a little bit of rough silver around the edges. I need to sand them, and I'm keeping my sanding drum, my 220 grit sanding drum, wet while I'm doing it, which otherwise it would just get too hot for your fingers. So again, the key is to get the two pieces looking the same. I've displayed them here so you can see that they do look pretty much identical, ready for the next step. Now I'm going to drill about a 1 millimeter hole at the top of each piece. I left the tip of the teardrop shape to drill my hole, and that's where the earring will actually attach to the ear wire when I'm all done. So this is a good time to be doing that. Can't really see the drill go in from that angle. Now I'm marking them to do a little stamp work. I'm going to use a stamp, and I want to create some lines stamped into the bottom of the teardrop. And I'm going to go for kind of a feather kind of look on this, and you'll see what I mean in just a minute. So here I am now doing the stamp work, and you want to hold the stamp and stare at it when you hit it so that you don't miss it when you hit it with your hammer. And I use just a light hammer for this. If you use a real heavy hammer, it will pierce the silver, and then you got to start the whole piece over. So it's good to use a light hammer for stamping. Now I like to use a triangular file to go in now and shape where I've made each line comes out at the end of the piece. I'm going to go in there and create a notch and then round those notches to create kind of a feathered look at the ends of those lines that I stamped into the piece. Now I'm doing some last final trimming of the silver on my drum, and I'm also sanding the back, which is a little bit rough. Get those looking good, ready for buffing. You can see they're looking pretty good. Now we're going over to the buffing wheel, and I like to use a little ring clamp. The wooden thing in my hand is called a ring clamp, and where I've got a little bit of metal sticking out on the edges of this bezel, I can get it in my ring clamp, and it makes a handy way to get the buffing job done on each of these earrings. And you can see my technique here. I keep a little thing of water nearby. If the earring gets too hot, I can just dip it in the water. And here I'm doing it from the other side. You want to get the back real well buffed. And women really like to look at the backs of the jewelry as well, so you want to make sure that you don't neglect a good mirror finish on the back of your pieces. So that's what I'm attending to here as I'm getting the jewelry buffed. This is a hard felt wheel on a tapered spindle buff. And you can see I've got kind of a homemade plywood shroud I made around it. And here I am using a flexible shaft buff to do some detailed buff work as I'm coming down the home stretch on these earrings. And I want to just say, definitely all of these operations, you want to make sure you're wearing eye protection. And when I'm using the buffing, whether it's the flexible shaft that you see here, or even the bigger buffing machine, I definitely like to wear a mask as well, because the buffing compound and the wool from the buff will make a dust, and I just don't want to be breathing that. So I'm really doing a nice buff around the edges of this earring and also right up against the bezel. And I really like using the flexible shaft tool for this. And you can't hear the machine running because I have the sound off on it, but the flexible shaft, you run it at a lower speed when you're buffing something like this, so that the piece doesn't go flying out of your hands. Run it too fast, you can lose control. So I'm easing off on the speed. I have a foot controller I use for this. Okay, I've got my stones going in now, and I'm just pushing the bezel up around each stone using my bezel roller, an inexpensive tool, but one you really need in your shop. And getting it looking nice and tight up around each stone. It's looking really good. I like it. And once I've rolled the bezel up around the stone, I just like to do a nice last minute touch-up buff around on the bezel, just to get any scuff marks off and to make it nice and shiny once the tool's no longer going to be on the piece. So that's what I'm doing here. And this is really the last finishing that you're going to be doing on the piece. Looks really nice. I might want to hit the back a little bit if there's a scuff mark there. So I'm going to hit that very briefly. And I got it. Now I just use a clean toothbrush with some rubbing alcohol to clean off any buffing compound. And wipe it down. Get any residue off. And at this point, all I have to do is attach the ear wires, which I purchase already made, and the earrings are finished, ready for a beautiful woman to wear. And if my wife was home instead of working, I'd be able to have her model them for you. Hope you enjoyed the video.